Thank you so much, Mo, and thank you so much, Scott. I really appreciate being here tonight with everyone, seeing new and familiar faces. Some folks, like Jim, I've been working with for over a decade. As mentioned, both of my children went to St. Francis. I have a son who currently goes here. He's played for the Saints for 2 years. And there was something very important left off my CV. One of the points I'm most proud of. My daughter played the role of Belle in Beauty and the Beast musical right over there a few years ago. But as mentioned, I'm a public health professor, and I've spent my career looking at the impacts of deportation on families and communities like ours, right? Families and communities in the Midwest and in rural areas. I'm originally from Texas, so I've learned that the way immigration enforcement and deportation happens here is often very different than the way it happens in Texas. And we have to count on people, we have to count on allies, and we have to count on communities that may not be close to immigrants themselves to do lots of this work. Now, my research focused on the worksite raids that happened during the first Trump administration. There were 6 worksite raids. And in these worksite raids, many people were arrested and many people were deported, ranging from 30 in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, to a few hundred in other states. And we managed to visit all 6 of those sites. And what I want to tell you today, I want to do 3 things. I want to tell you about the harms of deportation and really emphasize that it's not just the person targeted who's impacted, but those impacts of deportation ripple out into families, into communities, and into schools like the one we're in now. I want to tell you second how we saw churches respond throughout the country to efforts of mass deportation. And then right before we go into the panel, I want to remind us that policies reflect our values, and that we as Catholics, when we support immigration policies, we want those policies to reflect what we believe in. So let me take you first to Meade Station, Tennessee. So this is a picture of an immigration raid that happened in Meade Station, Tennessee at a meat packing plant. You can see, the date was a Thursday. So this is a Thursday in April, right? Any given Thursday in April. This is security cam footage from the raid. I'm a professor. I love calling on my students in the audience and folks in the audience. What are some things that we see in this picture? Nothing too slight, nothing too major. What are some things you see in this picture? And if you've heard this presentation before, refrain from answering, please. What do we see in this picture? Is that a hand up? Hands on heads, yes. What hands on heads, what does that mean to us? What do you think?
Not fighting back.
Not fighting back, right? So definitely we see this display of power, right? ICE agents are coming into these facilities armed. What else? Sure. Yes, and how do you know they were in the middle of working?
The aprons.
Aprons on, yes, I heard it over there and I heard it over here, yes. It's a meat packing plant, right? So they were doing the often ugly, grisly work of disassembling, in this case, cow carcasses, which is not an unfamiliar type of work to many folks who are detained and deported. What else do we see?
There are an awful lot of officers.
There's a lot of officers. So these are very resource-intensive enforcement operations. There's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of officers and vehicles, right, all surrounding these towns. And when we've interviewed these towns throughout the rural US, one of the things that always stands out is they say, we heard the helicopter and we knew something catastrophic was going on. Right? They see things like militarized helicopters, these that stick in the memories of these communities. What else do we see?
Are those 2 women on the side?
That's a good question. So are these 2 women? I can't speak to the actual photo, but it's worth thinking about the demographics of these enforcement operations. Generally speaking, this type of work is most often done by men. These type of arrests generally tend to be more men than women, though it's not always the case. What else?
They're all standing behind them.
The officers are standing behind them. Yes, the officers are standing behind them. They have their hands on their heads. I'll share one other thing about the location. The reason enforcement operations happen in facilities like this, the reason they often happen in communities like ours, in mobile home communities, is because there's only one or two exits. It's very easy to arrest everyone, question everyone as they're leaving. We've seen in our community agents near the exits as folks are doing things like going to work or taking their kids to school. I see a hand back there, yes?
In general, it looks like just a rough and unsafe environment.
A rough and unsafe environment is accurate, right? So the work is dangerous, the work is gritty. I am looking for one specific thing. Anybody have another thought of what it is? Yes?
Armored vests.
Armored vests, yes. So in the militarization and also the cost of the enforcement, right? There's lots of money that goes into this type of enforcement. Is that a hand? You look like you might know what it is.
I don't know if they're unmasked. They're like not
The agents aren't masked, which is actually a big change from how it is now. The agents tend to be masked. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to show you. It's a Thursday. It's a hint. What time is that?
Morning.
9:20 a.m.
9:20 a.m. One of my favorite things about being a public health professor is that you get to bring something up that once that light bulb goes on, once you make the connection, you can never unlearn the lesson. Thursday at 9:30. Many of these people are parents.
They drop their kids off at school.
They drop their kids off at school. A school not unlike this one, right? Every time there's a deportation, whenever there's family involved, 9 months of the year, right? There's going to be kids at school. Every time. And who does the responsibility fall on to explain deportation to these children if it's a school?
Faculty.
Faculty, teachers, exactly. Teachers like those that educate our children, right? Educate our children's friends and their classmates. Right, so what happens in this particular raid in Bean Station, once parents are arrested, as you can imagine, everyone is suddenly staying in their homes, especially because they worry about being racially profiled. In this particular instance, like we have another image, and there was a lawsuit that happened. The lawsuit was actually in Ohio, but to the point here, the agents were white, and they arrested the Latino workers, while the white workers took a cigarette break. So what you see in school is not the absence of all students, just the absence of some students, just the absence of Latino students. And what the research shows is that educational gap develops because what happens? Absenteeism increases just among one group, and scores go down just among one group. Every time there's deportation, among the many things you see, is massive numbers of absences. In this case in Morristown, average number of absences on any given day, 75. The day after the raid, there were 560 absences. Over 7.5 times more students just didn't go to school the next day. Now, learning and socializing is not the only thing we do in school, right? So we see there's a raid, children aren't going to school. What else do we do in school that they may be missing? Oh, you got this one right away. What was it? Lunch. They eat, right? And in many, many public schools, you're actually going for the food, for the free and reduced lunch. So when there's deportation, there's absences. When there's absences, many of those students aren't eating. This is only one mechanism through which students and children and others in the community stop eating. So in Bean Station, just like places throughout the country, because students depend on the school for their lunches, when they're not going to school, they're also not eating. Now there's a couple of other reasons that folks end up without food on the table. What do we think some of those reasons might be? Yes?
Their parents can't work.
Their
But
parents.
also the fact they're missing breakfast, because in most places you get breakfast and lunch. So they're really missing most of the food for the day.
Could be missing.
The
Sorry,
parents
go ahead.
themselves would be scared to go out. I know I would be. So how are you going to get food?
So you identify two things. One is that parents are scared to go out, right? So deportation happened, 98 people were arrested, but hundreds of others are scared to drive. And when you don't drive, We know from our public health research, we know from our own lives, when you're not leaving your home, it's pretty hard to stay healthy. You're not getting food, among the many things you're not doing, but you're also just not able to be with your family. You're not going to church, you're not going to baptisms, you're not going again to school. And you also identified that worksite raids take workers. Right? By definition, we're removing people who are working. We're removing people who are generating the income for their house and for their families. Right? So this happens, generally speaking, all deportations have these type of ripple effects. So what we've thought of right now, or what I've described to you, is the way this looks unfolding in a school setting, unfolding in a community environment. But it's also a great example of what happens directly in a home environment, right? So 2 frames that we use in the academic world are suddenly single motherhood and abrupt transitions to adulthood. And I'll explain them briefly because it's easy to wrap your head around. Once you hear them, you'll always think about them whenever you hear about deportation. Suddenly single motherhood, given that it's often men, though not exclusively, but often men who are detained, is when a parent in a two-parent household suddenly finds themselves in the position to be single because often the breadwinner was removed. Usually, in the best case scenario, this cuts your household income in half, right? Just cuts it in half because you're losing one provider. But much more often, it's taking away all of the income. Because one thing that many families do is cluster their risk. One parent can stay at home and watch children and drive less, and another can work and drive, and the deportation risk falls to one person. When that person is removed, the parent remaining in the home finds herself suddenly single. What's also notable is that these cases in which one parent suddenly disappears, often work-related injury, going to the hospital, or death, the U.S. government has ways to support the family members that are left behind. Undocumented family members are not eligible for any of these resources. So the parent left behind, often the mother, now has to deal with the lack of income while dealing with all of the emotional fallout of walking her children through the disappearance of a parent. Now, abrupt transitions to adulthood is also a very useful way to understand what happens. As of right now, I've talked to you a bit about students, but also parents. There's also siblings in these families. Siblings, there's a number of things that children do as they progress to adulthood. Like our daughter, they drive and terrify their parents. They also do things like go to college, right, or get a job, have children at some point. But abrupt transitions to adulthood means that they're forced to be more mature at a time in their life when they were not ready. To put it most simply, what often happens is when a provider is removed, a sibling, a child, often has to take a job. And in order to take that job, they often do things like drop out of college or drop out of school. Older siblings often become a replacement parent, a father or a mother, once a parent is removed. Now, I think it's pretty easy to summarize the decade and a half of work that I've done on deportation. The work, I see a copy of my first book, Separated, is actually about, thank you, is actually about a home raid that happened 7 miles from where we are, right? So this is our home community. Follow-up book was about worksite raids throughout the country. And if I were to summarize all of what I was seeing, all of the impacts of this work, it's that every time there's a deportation, it causes hunger, it causes homelessness, it causes imprisonment, and it causes sickness. Well, how does it cause sickness? Well, as we identify, people aren't driving, not going to the hospital, not checking in at clinics, not eating. Again, no matter how you feel about immigration law or deportation or who's being targeted, these are objectively the outcomes of what happens after deportation every single time. Now, sometimes we see them on a massive scale, and we see entire school districts change because of deportation. And sometimes we see it on a small scale, where families will change because of deportation. So, One thing I've also learned by doing work with communities throughout the country is that nobody sits by and lets their family members be removed without doing something about it, right? Nobody sits by and lets it happen. People throughout the country always have creative ways to show resistance and show agency, and no place more so than churches throughout the country. Here you see St. Patrick's, the church that is in Morristown, right next to Bean Station, where I just talked about the raid. You also see Paris, Texas, following the raid in summer, that same summer. And you see Mount Pleasant, Iowa, Catholic Church and 2 Christian churches. And these are just 3 of many, many examples of dozens of churches who respond after immigration raids. Now, what did they do? Any guesses as to what some of these churches did? What's that? They fed them. And I actually love the way they fed them, right? They fed communities in a few ways. One of these churches turned all their empty space into a food bank. So they bring in cans, bring in non-perishable items, come pick up food. Another church had a kitchen, and this was, I believe, in Texas, and they used that kitchen to feed over 1,000 meals, make over 1,000 meals to people who weren't going to get their groceries and weren't able to eat. Other churches raised money, but there were many ways in which churches actually fed the people in their communities. Yes, what else did they do? Guesses? Sure.
Transportation to appointments or shopping or...
That's a great one. Transportation. So in Sandusky and Salem, Ohio, our neighbors, they set up a ride share with the church among them. And what they did is, yes, right on, they transported them to doctor's appointments, to get fingerprinted, to do paperwork. Because one of the ironies of immigration enforcement and deportation is that when you're detained, you have a whole lot of stuff the government requires to do. If you're detained and you're released pending your case, there's a whole lot of stuff the government requires you to do. You gotta get passports renewed and fingerprints and medical exams, but you don't have a license. So they're asking you to go everywhere while you're unable to go everywhere. So developing these ride shares was absolutely fundamental to helping people move about their communities, yes. Just a few other examples. Churches opened their doors to people who didn't want to go home or weren't able to go home, and folks were able to sleep in the pews, right? So churches responded, yes?
Excuse me. I'm not going to respond to the church, but I got to talk to you about community colleges.
Sure.
And I was involved in accreditations, and I can give you 2 examples of what you're talking about, and it dealt with the fact that they taught ESL classes. One was in Arkansas, Hope, Arkansas. You can identify where Bill Clinton was from, and Arkadelphia, and the other one was in Nebraska. And the one in Nebraska was very interesting because Cargill had a meat packing company there, and they had to turn down to retool. So they sent the workers who were Hispanic to the community college there to learn English. And then in Arkansas, they came up from Corpus Christi. There's a road that goes right up to Little Rock, and on the way, they were actually helping the school district survive, and it was quite interesting. I interviewed the superintendent, and it was a very positive thing because it was building their populations.
And thanks for those examples. I want to highlight one point that you said among many. ESL teachers are actually often the ones who are explaining what's happening to students. And one of the key findings, right, one of the key things we see in doing this work is that there's always trusted folks between the immigrant community and often the school district, right, or politicians. And folks like ESL teachers end up being essential. So I summarized the impacts of deportation, and I can actually summarize after ICE raids, I can summarize what churches did in a way that makes me feel very good about how Christian and Catholic churches respond. Churches fed the hungry, they sheltered the homeless, they visited the imprisoned, and as you said, they drove around sick folks too. They healed the sick, right? This should make us This should bring all of our Catholic schooling to the fore. We've read these lines before, right? If I were to summarize again, after Ice Rage churches fed the hungry, sheltered the homeless, visited the imprisoned, and healed the sick. And I asked one of our volunteers, one of the volunteers, Destiny, why she did it. She said, no, the Bible told me to do it. For many folks, it was direct results of their religious teaching. Not everyone. And one of the beautiful things about how church is organized is they welcomed everyone into the space. Catholic, Christian, non-denominational, immigrant, non-immigrant. It was a space for blending and aligning yourself along these beliefs of feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, visiting the imprisoned, and healing the sick. So when I saw churches respond, I saw them respond in a way very much aligned with our faith teaching. But let's think about what else our faith teaching, what else our Catholic faith teaches us before we move on to the panel, and think about where we can go with policies in the future. I'm pulling just 3 of the most important Catholic teachings to me, directly related to immigration. One is the right to immigrate and to not immigrate. This is really fundamental. Not only are we called to welcome folks who are leaving a country, but we're called to believe in policies that never force folks to leave their country in the first place. People have the right not only to migrate, but to live in a place that they don't want to leave. Second, we are called to protect the refugee and the asylee. We are called to welcome folks who are fleeing violence and who are fleeing poverty in their home countries. And lastly, and maybe most importantly for this current discussion, Catholicism believes in a balance of national sovereignty and the common good. What that means is, generally speaking, Catholicism believes in countries with borders and immigration laws. But those laws need to reflect our values as Catholics. We don't need to support all immigration laws. We need to advocate for laws that reflect what we support. So if we look at just a few of the policies, we can think about what values these policies may suggest. I left that column blank for you. I want you to think about what are the values inherent in these immigration policies. And I just took a couple. I want to represent a broader swath of time here instead of just the just the current administration. But in 1994, in the Clinton era, we had prevention through deterrence. And prevention through deterrence funneled migrants into the Sonoran Desert, where they were more likely to die, believing that if the threat of death was there, they would no longer migrate. Think about what that says about our values. In 2018, we remember the same summer that we saw these immigration raids like that in Main Station that I just highlighted for you, zero tolerance policy. Zero tolerance policy means that everyone who crossed the border, all border entries were felonies, and if you have a felony, you cannot stay in the same facility as your child, right? Fundamentally, we remember this to be family separation. In 2025, so these last 2 are very recent, we had the sensitive locations. We had changes to sensitive locations, in which enforcement can now take place in courthouses, hospitals, schools, and churches. So these are our current immigration policies. These are the policies. What are the values that we see inherent in these policies? And last, I want to just bring up Noam versus Vasquez Perdomo. This was the case out of LA that Noam won, saying that ICE can indeed stop you based on the color of your skin. Right? So we see the codification of racial profiling based on this last policy. So I want to wrap up and switch to our panel and think about how we put in place policies that we can support, how we put in place policies that reflect our values as Catholics. I want to remind you of this quote from Matthew, of this line from Matthew, which is directly reflective of what we saw churches throughout the country doing in response to deportation in the summer of 2018. For I was hungry and you gave me to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you visited me. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to continue the conversation. Feel free to email. I have copies of the book back there too if anybody wants to read a bit more. I love coming to book clubs. If you all are in book clubs, I'm always happy to join. You're welcome to follow me on email or follow me on Instagram. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to you.